let's go on in verse 10. It says, and not only this story of Isaac and Ishmael and Sarah and Abraham, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose, according to his choice, would stand. Not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, and here again we're going to see that Paul makes categories again. And all these categories he's making are just tied back to the categories he makes at the beginning of the chapter, when he contrasts fleshly descendants of Abraham with true spiritual descendants of Abraham. And so at this point, he's going to do that same thing again when he brings up Jacob and Esau. And so he says the older, which was Esau, right? Here's the first category. The older will serve the younger. So here's those categories. So, which again ties into, so the first category, the older, Esau. So he'd be in the category of children of the flesh. That Esau is a picture, a spiritual picture of those who are merely Israelite according to the flesh. He's a picture of the flesh. And Jacob, he's that picture here of valuing the Lord, that picture of faith, that picture of, he wrestled with God, and ultimately he gave up, and he learned surrender to God. He learned reliance on God. And so I think Jacob and Esau are a stark contrast. Again, Paul brings it up to contrast not ultimately the predetermined, Calvinistically elect versus the Calvinistically non-elect, but to contrast those who approach God on the basis of the flesh or on the basis of works, and those who approach God on the basis of faith. And so I'll explain a little bit more why I think that's clearly what's going on here. So think about this. He says the older, right? The older will serve the younger. So Esau was the older, right? So by all human standards, by all human wisdom, the older brother should have got the blessing. He should have been the one chosen by God. But even before they were born, God said, I choose not the older one, not the stronger one, not the more manly one, not the one who by all human standards should be first in first place. But what I choose is the younger one. This is just another way where God is saying, what he says all the time. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, right? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And so it's the weak, it's the person without strength. It's the person who by all human standards should not be first, who should not receive God's favor. Those are actually the ones God has chosen. 1 Corinthians, I think, explains this and is a great example of what's being communicated here by the illustrations of Jacob and Esau. So 1 Corinthians 1, 20 through 31 says, where is the wise person? And so again, here's these categories. Where is the wise person according to the flesh? Where is the teacher of the law? Here's the strength and the human wisdom, what man has to bring to the table. Where's the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Since in the wisdom of God, the world, so this is all, again, this is worldly strength. This is human wisdom. This is another way of saying, the human strength and effort and energy and willpower and what man has to bring to the table. But in the wisdom of God, the world, through its own wisdom, did not know God. But God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. So there's a foolishness to the message preached to the human mind, to human understanding. But this is what God has chosen. And then verse 22, he says, Jews demand signs, Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Again, at the end of Romans 9, I think we saw in the first video, and we'll see again when we get to the end of the chapter, that it says that the Jews have stumbled over this stumbling stone. And so what is the stumbling stone? Well, the stumbling stone here we see is the simple, foolish message of faith in Christ as the way of salvation. That's foolishness to the Gentile or to the Jew who wants to bring something to the table. And it's easy for the self-righteous person to stumble over the gospel because the gospel is so simple, and it requires that we do nothing but believe, while self-righteousness wants to actually do something. It wants to add something. Self-righteousness wants to do its own part, while God says the foolishness of the gospel is that he doesn't require us to do anything. It's just all by our belief and our faith in him. And so it says, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Here's a lot of Jacobs. Not many of you were wise. Not many of you were firstborn sons, is another way of saying this. Jacob was the secondborn, right? Who, again, by all human standards, should not have been first in God's mind, should not have received God's favor. But God chose him as a picture that what he chooses in the world turns human wisdom and human standards upside down. God chose not the firstborn son, Esau. God chose the secondborn son, Jacob. And so this is him saying that in another way in 1 Corinthians. He's saying, not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. So by all human standards, Paul says to the Corinthians, you should have been in last place. By all human standards, you should not be inheriting the promises of God. By all human standards, you should not be righteous and accepted by God, because you're weak, you're foolish, you're not anything special. And that's Jacob. That was Jacob, his case, being the second-born son. Again, God choosing him over Esau is a picture of how he chooses the things that are weak. And that's what he says right here. It says, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things. God chose the Jacobs. God chose the Isaacs who came as a result of absolute human weakness and inability. Isaac came about as a result of Abraham and Sarah's dead bodies, who had zero to bring to the table. All they could do is say, God, you said this is going to happen, and so we believe it. And they did nothing to help God bring about Isaac. And that is the weak thing of the world. But God uses those kind of things, those kind of people, to shame the strong. And in the case of Romans 9, what this looks like is God choosing the Gentiles in the world who are coming to God simply on the basis of faith, who don't have all these things that the Jews have to bring to the table before God. They don't have a DNA connection to Abraham. The promises weren't made to their nationalities. They don't have the law and the promises. The Messiah didn't come through their lines, and so they have nothing. They're in second place, just like Jacob was, just like Isaac was, in the sense that there is no human reason why he should have even been alive. And in this sense, it says that's the people of the world, the things of the world that God has chosen. And so in this sense, the Jews who are coming to God with their strength, they're coming to God with their law keeping, with their self-righteousness, with all these things that by all human standards should impress God. By all human wisdom, it should be, we would expect God to look at that and be impressed and to say, well, if you're going to do all that, well, yeah, I'll bless you. But that's just not the way God works. But rather, he chooses those who come to him with nothing. He chooses here, continuing in 1 Corinthians 1:28, he chose the lowly things. And I think, in my opinion, this is all, these are all synonyms of faith. He chose belief. Faith is the weak thing. Belief is the weak thing. Faith is something that in the Bible it's contrasted with works. Faith is never described as a work. Faith is never said to be, if you bring faith to the table, then you're bringing something. But if we have an accurate biblical understanding of what faith is, then we'll understand that to bring faith to God, to believe him when he provides his word and provides the ability to believe in what he's spoken to us, the light he's given, when we believe, we're not bringing anything to the table. But biblically, bringing faith to the table equals bringing nothing to the table. That's the biblical way to look at it. And so God chose that. He chose the lowly things of this world, the despised things. Jacob, again, we're talking about Jacob and Esau. So Jacob, being the second born, would, by the human standards of those days, been the despised, the ignored thing, the lesser important thing. The things that are not, to nullify the things that are. And so again, in the context of Romans 9, the things that are in this context would be the strong things of law keeping, the strong things of self-righteousness, of DNA connection to Abraham, all these things the Jews were bringing to God, and now offended because God was saying, I don't accept that, I don't want that, and actually I choose this. I choose the Gentiles who are coming merely on the basis of faith. And he says he does that so that no one may boast before him. So going back to Romans 9, the older, Esau, is that picture, again, of strength. He's the picture of what a human would have to bring to the table before God, of self-effort, willpower, self-reliance, which all ultimately, what all those things ultimately mean is a lack of confidence in God, a lack of belief that he's going to get done what he's promised, just like Abraham and Sarah did in that season when they produced Ishmael. While the younger, Jacob, again, is that picture of the foolishness of simply accepting the gospel. The foolishness in 1 Corinthians is what? It's what's contrasted with the wise thing according to human standards. The wise thing would be the Jews who are attempting to come to God with their strength. The foolish thing is those who simply believe in the gospel, who simply believe like Abraham did. That's the foolish thing. That's what Jacob here is a spiritual analogy of, going back to what Paul says when he spells it out for us in Galatians, when he brings up examples from the Old Testament, when he's dealing with this issue of faith versus works, and he spells it out for us in Galatians 4:24, where he says these things are to be taken figuratively, or they're an illustration, they're to be taken allegorically. So they're illustrations, they're spiritual illustrations, he says. That's what Isaac was. And I think it's fair to say that's what Jacob and Esau are. He's bringing these up as spiritual illustrations. And Jacob serves as the same illustration as Isaac. That it's not an illustration, it's not an example, I guess, of an unconditionally elect according to a Calvinistic understanding. And Esau would stand in the same category. He's the same spiritual illustration as Ishmael was, which was an example, and an allegory of human unbelief and human effort and energy, and ultimately of self-righteousness. And that completely makes sense in this whole context when we see that what Paul's dealing with is the same issue in a different form, but it's the same issue as Galatians, where he's dealing with people who are so bound up in their minds with a works-based mentality, sort of with the law, with the importance of their Israelite descent, and which all are important things, and they're all blessed things, as Paul says at the beginning. But they misunderstand that they misunderstood that it's those things that are giving them righteousness before God, and that's their fault. That's really what's screwing them up, and that's what this whole thing is about. And I think, again, as we're looking at Galatians, it's so important to look at Galatians when trying to understand Romans 9. And I think it makes it so clear what Paul is really trying to get at here.